Wonderful to be here in Hamburg at the conference. I know we are probably the last podium today after a long day, but I'm very happy that still some people are attending, and I hope you will say that this was worthwhile here. And you see the topic, I don't need to repeat it. We have wonderful people assembled here to discuss this topic, and I would like to introduce Catherine Marie Russell from UNICEF, since 2022 Executive Director of UNICEF. Before, she was Assistant to President Joe Biden, Director of the White House Office of Presidential Personnel, Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues at the US Department of State, Deputy Assistant to President Barack Obama. I could go on and go on. You have a... Yes. No. You have a BA from Boston and a PhD in law from George Washington. So please welcome Catherine Marie Russell. And we have David Miliband, President and CEO of International Rescue Committee. He has been in his job since 2013. Before, he was the 74th Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, UK, under former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, Member of Parliament before, and he has a BA from Oxford and a Master's from the MIT. So, welcome, Yay. David. And we have Anneliese Dodds. I just learned that Anneliese is not a German first name, but a Scottish one put together by two different names, and she can explain that to you if we have time afterwards. The Minister for Development in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office since July. Before that, she was for 3 years the chair of the Labour Party. Before that, in 2017, elected as Member of Parliament, and she has been Member of the European Parliament. You remember, Great Britain used to be Member of the European Union. As an education, she has a BA from Oxford again, and the Masters in Social Policy at the University of Edinburgh, and a PhD in Government at the London School of Economics. Wonderful to have all of you here. And I would like to start with you, Catherine. When you listen to the topic here, how we have more and more conflicts on the globe, the number of conflicts is increasing every year. How does this affect UNICEF, your work in the field, when more and more conflicts are taking place, and you have to see how you cope with that?
Yeah, well, it affects us in a really incredibly difficult way, which is to say, the estimates are, roughly 460 million children live either in conflict-affected areas or they're people who've been displaced, children have been displaced. So the number itself is staggering, as you suggest. Every time we turn around, honestly, I've been in the job now about 2.5 years. I started, and 2 weeks later, there was the invasion in Ukraine. Last year we had Gaza. This year we have Sudan. Today and yesterday we have Lebanon. So it just keeps coming, right? Every year it seems we have another problem, and none of the old problems really go away. So for children, you can imagine either they're directly impacted, they're killed, they're injured in conflict, or, and this is a really profound problem for children, they rely on government systems, right? They rely on healthcare and education, and those are always disrupted in times of conflict or crisis. So UNICEF is there. We work in most places in the world. We're there, sort of before, during, and after a crisis. So we're trying to help build the resilience of these communities. But I can't say that the impact on children is not god-awful. And I think every politician in the world, excuse me, David, used to be a politician, talks about children and the future. Well, there is no future if these children are not healthy and educated. And we're living in a world now where that's just increasingly hard to do.
David, you have been in your job for 11 years now. Have you witnessed some periods where you had the impression things are going better?
Well, it's been a very tough 10 years. If you look at the statistics, there are now 300 million people in humanitarian need, and 10 years ago, the figure was about 80 million. There's 120 million people who are refugees and displaced people. The figure 10 years ago was about 45 million. So that 10-year period has been one of marked disaster for increasing numbers of people in increasing numbers of countries. And I think it's also important to say it's been a time of marked politicization and polarization of whether or not these people need and can be helped. So the title of this panel, which is about adjusting for conflict-affected states, seems to me to underestimate what's necessary. We need to transform the kind of intervention that is offered to support people in conflict-affected states. We need to transform it from a reactive mode to a proactive mode. Germany, I think I'm right in saying, is the only country in the world that said that 5% of its humanitarian budget should be for anticipatory action, but it's not yet met that standard, so we need to go into a proactive mode. Secondly, we need to move from the fiction that crises are short-term to understanding that they're long-term, because Kathy is absolutely right to say the old crises have not gone away. Old can mean Democratic Republic of Congo, but old can also mean Syria or the Rohingya in Bangladesh, who in many ways are forgotten. So we have to go from the fiction that these are short-term crises to a recognition that the most likely outcome of a civil war is renewed conflict. So we've got to think about this in the long term. Thirdly, we've also got to transform our approach from being what we would call government-centered to being people-centered, because the whole point of a fragile conflict setting is that the government's in the mix in the conflict, and you can't just rely on traditional systems to reach people in areas that are affected with non-state groups, conflict going on, displacement, and the rest of it. So we have to have a much more adaptable model that really does speak to crisis context rather than these artificial silos of what's humanitarian and what's development. 10 years ago, we rewrote our mission statement from helping, quote unquote, refugees and others to help all those whose lives are shattered by conflict or disaster and to help them survive, recover, and gain control of their futures. And that focus on crisis seems to me to be more and more important. Final point, I think I'm right in saying that now more than half of the world's extreme poor are in fragile and conflict states. That percentage is only going up. And it's going to, according to Brookings Institution, it's going to be 60%, or two-thirds actually, 66%, by 2030.
Well, Anneliese, you have a lot of experience as parliamentarian, now being in government, facing the situation as was described. How do you see this now after a few months in office? You had the summit in New York, you have your ministry now, you have this development policy instrument. How do you see this? How do you cope with this challenge that we are describing in your new job now?
Yeah, well, I would say that I view it in a very similar way, actually, to that which has already been set out. And I'm really pleased that we're having this discussion. It could not be more important now. We've obviously heard already the statistics about the number of people globally who are impacted by conflict. I would add to that the fact that increasingly we're seeing those who are impacted by the climate crisis and extreme poverty also being impacted by conflict as well. So there's that triple whammy also existing in many countries. And overall, of course, we see the number of countries that are in conflict now at a high since records began. So I think it's 59 now, the highest number since 1946 when records started for counting the number of countries in conflict. So we really do need to be bringing these worlds together, and that's a priority for the new government in the UK. As I said, I agree with the points that have been made. I'll just add on a few more, if I may, briefly. First of all, when it comes to development, we have to ensure that development is conflict sensitive. Now, that's an easy phrase to say, but to deliver it, of course, is far harder. And it does involve significant expertise, understanding where power relationships are, sometimes quite difficult conversations, especially when being determined to work in partnership. But we have to have that focus on people that David mentioned, if we're ultimately to make sure that in delivering development, we're not worsening conflict, either in the short or the medium or long term. Secondly, we have to recognize there's been a decline in investment in peace. I mean, clearly the strongest argument for peace is a moral argument, no question about that. But the World Bank has indicated that for every dollar that you spend on peace and on conflict resolution, that reduces eventual costs for the international community of $16. I mean, clearly we should be doing this anyway as an international community, but there's such a strong financial argument, we need to make that more clearly too. I would argue that we also need to ensure that the voices of women and girls are at the heart of these discussions. You know, my view is they should be in any case when it comes to development, because so often women and girls hold the key to development, but also when it comes to conflict too. And I know people in this room will not be ignorant of the huge amount of research that's been done into this and the positive impact of girls and women being involved in conflict resolution. Finally, I think we need to be clear about the inverse of this argument, the fact that a lack of development, a lack of opportunity is clearly fueling conflict. So we can't have the two separate worlds of security and development. And again, one reason why I'm so pleased to be part of this discussion. Thank you.
Can I just follow up, Anneliese? Because you have been in government now early, the first month. We see in Britain, as in Germany, that with regard to our budgets, we have quite some difficulties. And just to see how we add up to get a balanced budget or not too high debt, etc. We in Germany have the impression that one of those who suffer most is our Ministry for Development Cooperation, is humanitarian aid. How do you cope with, how do you see that in Britain right now?
Well, I've always been very clear that we can't have overall an argument that in supporting other countries and people in other parts of the world, we're somehow reducing the chances of people in a nation like the UK. That's first of all true because so many people now in my country have links to the rest of the world. So 18% of the UK population now have parents or themselves were born outside the UK. But secondly, it's true because when we consider the matters that people in my country care about, they're obviously intrinsically linked with concerns of people around the world, whether that's the climate crisis now hitting the UK just as it is other countries, with the first civil disaster in the UK linked to the climate crisis, whether it's the lack of economic growth that we see impacting countries like the UK, and ultimately actually at the root of some of those financial and fiscal problems for countries like the UK that clearly is also rooted in a lack of global growth, or whether indeed it's pandemics, other health problems, which in a world that has lowered borders for excellent reasons when it comes to the exchange of ideas, of people being able to travel, that we can't insulate ourselves ultimately from pandemics, etc. So we are interconnected. Now, of course, there are fiscal challenges, but just to end, that cannot reduce our ambition. We know the need is high. You know, David talked about the increased humanitarian load, and of course, Catherine spoke so powerfully about the fact that children now will only be children once. They don't get that time back again. So unless we're working together, ultimately, to face up to those challenges, we will reap the problems from that in the future.
I think you're absolutely right in this, and you quoted before, I think the World Bank saying every dollar you invest early on gets so much out in the end, and therefore this all speaks for a lot of investment in the programs you mentioned. Catherine, when you mentioned that to your counterparts, those who are the biggest donors or ever governments that support UNICEF, how does this argument, what is the response to this argument? How do you see right now the donor situation?
Yeah. Well, we get most of our money from governments.
Yes.
Okay, so the United States is the top donor. Germany is right behind. I think that governments understand the importance of doing the work, but they have challenges too. And I think this is some of what Anneliese is referring to, which is they have political problems, they have budget problems. We understand all that. We know that children have to be invested in, that poor countries or developing countries have to be invested in. But we're working hard to try to diversify where we get our funds from. We do a lot of fundraising with the private sector, which has, it's complicated, but we get a lot of support from the private sector. We appreciate that. In Germany, we have something called a national committee, which raises money here, excuse me, in Germany. And so it's the public that supports it, which I think is important because that also bucks up the government to say this is a priority. We do a lot of work now with the, excuse me, with the IFIs, and I think that is a place where there is greater potential. And again, they're trying to get countries developed. So if we can come in and make sure that the perspective of children, the rights of children, the issues around children are included, then I think that's all to the good. UNICEF works, as I said, in almost every country. A lot of the work we do is in middle-income countries where there are a lot of poor children, and we can't forget that either. A lot of the conversations are around crisis because the challenges are so extraordinary and the numbers are so difficult, but there are poor children in many, many places, and our job, our mission, our effort is to try to help all of them. Again, I think governments mostly understand the importance of that, but they have some constraints themselves, and they're trying to be as supportive as they can, but it's an ongoing effort.
I mean, UNICEF, at least in Germany, worldwide, has this wonderful image of doing such an important job. So from what you say, you are concerned, but not too concerned that there will be the support.
Oh, I'm concerned.
You're
No.
concerned. Okay, good.
For the record, I'm very concerned and very grateful. Very grateful.
Wanted to say that. Now, how successful, David, are you also in what you mentioned about getting private funding, getting business involved, and for companies to understand that to support you is also to support in the long range their business chances? Is this something that echoes with business? And by the way, I want to go to the public now after that.
I think there's a danger that we fall into happy talk,
Yes.
that the private sector is going to ride to the rescue
Yes.
and replace governments. In the places that we work, we're not an anti-poverty agency. We're an agency focused on people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster, 40 countries or so, for our international humanitarian work. We also do refugee and asylum support in Germany, in the UK, and in the US. But for our international humanitarian work, in the 40 countries that we're talking about, in Sudan, in Yemen, in Gaza, the private sector is not going to ride to the rescue. It might do $50,000 of emergency aid. It might do $500,000 of emergency aid. We're a $1.5 billion NGO now. I'll just point out to the Germans here, if you go through with your budget cut, the IRC budget will be bigger than the total German humanitarian budget. That is not something that I welcome, because really, a country of this wealth and scope and ambition should be doing more than $1 billion if we're a $1.5 billion agency. We've grown 3 times in the last 10 years, threefold in the last 10 years. But in the end, if governments don't fulfill their responsibilities to tackle humanitarian problems, we actually know how this movie ends, because unsolved, unaddressed humanitarian crises get worse. When humanitarian crises get worse, there isn't just a moral problem, there's also a practical problem that political instability comes in its wake. And then the crisis feeds on itself. And anyone who wants to see the danger, go and read The Economist's special issue on Sudan. 60% of the people trying to get to the UK from Calais today, according to The Economist, are from Sudan. And they're fleeing Sudan because Chad is next door one way, a very poor country. South Sudan, south, very poor country. They've got 1.5 million refugees between them, but people are not going to stay just in the Horn of Africa. I want to say one other thing, which I think is really important, though. From my perspective, my experience, successful or unsuccessful, we will never make the case for more money. Oops, maybe I misspoke. We'll never make the case for more money if we start with the case for more money. The place to start is with the impactful programs that we develop. That's why we always position ourselves as a solutions-oriented NGO. We don't advertise the suffering, we advertise the solutions, whether it be on early childhood development, whether it be on climate-resilient agriculture, whether it be on immunization beyond the reach of health ministries, whether it be on malnutrition treatment, where we need a complete revolution in the way malnutrition is understood. In all those areas, if you don't lead with the solution, you end up in a stupid argument about numbers, which no one can understand. Whereas actually what we need to lead with is impactful programs that can change lives, and then the investment case comes behind it. And I think we sometimes in the NGO community, we fall into the trap of arguing about figures when we should be arguing about interventions that change lives.
Yes, I think that's for another discussion, but when you look at Sudan, which is right now, I think, the worst humanitarian crisis, one wonders if on the political level enough is done by whoever to try to tackle that issue.
It's getting almost no attention,
Exactly.
which is shocking.
And this is, of course, something that we have to deplore. I mean, here in Germany, of course, we look a lot at what Ukraine, Russian aggression in Ukraine. We see the Middle East is on focus, and somehow Sudan is done. We try to make publicity here. We try in Munich to actually have this on the agenda, have Sudan, have Haiti. And by the way, the Rohingya is something that we want to bring back, because there's still 1 million people living out in Cox's Bazar, and what is happening, and nobody pays attention. So we have to bring it up, because it's also in the long-term interest of peace, security, stability, and development. So, questions from the floor. Yes, please introduce yourself, and we get a mic to you. Back in the first row.
Hi, Renu Mehta, founder of the Fortune Forum. So we have on the stage government, very large NGO, and a very effective multilateral organisation. So you've in fact all worked together, and I don't know if anyone here knows about the UK Aid Match, where the charity matches charity appeals, the government matches charity appeals pound for pound. Just a bit of a history, my late colleague, Sir James Mirrlees, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, he and I put these proposals to the government, and it was a Tory government after Gordon Brown looked at this and passed us the DFID and Treasury. So they took up those ideas, and between UK Aid Match, Garvey Matching Fund and the Malaria Matching Fund, all in all, that's totaled £500 million, but that was given over 13 years. And recently, we have published a report called UK Aid Match, Real Aid or Charity Washing. And the reason why we say charity washing is because this only represents about 0.2% of the aid budget, as opposed to GNI. So my question is, what are the plans for Aid Match? Can Labour rise to the challenge and make this 2%? And that will unlock literally billions for the IRC and UNICEF and some other great organisations, and Hope and Homes here. Can we have some sort of response on that? Very, very keen to hear what you've got to say.
Very happy to
Yes,
respond.
I think that was
Absolutely.
addressed to you, yes.
Yeah, thank you. You wouldn't expect me, obviously, to set out full details from the podium, particularly when we have our budgetary process, so what's called our spending review in the UK, where we're making these kinds of assessments and then setting out exactly how we will then spend our overseas development assistance. But I think the broad principle of that collaborative working, including with NGOs, but particularly with the public, is one that I'm very keen to underline as the new Minister for Development. And I suppose this relates a little bit to some of the discussion that we had previously, because I think when people can see the impact of aid, particularly when they understand that it's solving problems. So this is quite a different mindset, I think, sometimes to, dare I say it, sometimes how some charities might approach this, where it's not always in that kind of empowering lens, saying, right, together we can work with other countries, with the NGO sector, with multilateral organisations to achieve real changes, concrete changes, and the kind of changes that you would want for your own family if you're in that situation. Then I think there can be strong support. So I think that this is a really important agenda of bringing ultimately together those different coalitions in support of development. And that history that you set out is one that, I'm really proud of from the point of view of my country. So thank you for doing that now. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please, the lady with the red dress or red scarf.
Thank you. My name is Katie Gallos. I'm an international moderator, and thank you so much for outlining your priorities and your perspectives. What I'd like to ask is, there's this quote, everybody's talking now about resilience, how to build up resilience, but also that fragility is the new normal of the poly crisis, of the times of the poly crisis. My question is, how do you prepare for fragility? How do you prepare for implementation, especially in a country like South Sudan or Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, that's really also under threat? And what does it mean, this concept of fragility is the new normal, for mediation, for finding solutions, and for still staying in this narrative of we'd like to work towards solutions and not just talking about the crises? Maybe it's the $1 million question.
David.
First of all, I think you're right to say that fragility is the new normal, because we're living in a world that is more connected than ever before. But those very connections mean that global risks grow, because we're only all as strong as the weakest link in the chain. But here's the problem. We're all bound in a fragile web, but the resources for dealing with fragility are inversely proportional to the wealth of the country and its ability to invest in countering that fragility. So the most fragile places with the greatest levels of poverty have the least investment in anticipating crisis and building resilience. So that's the UNDP inverse proportion rule or practice. I want to address two parts of the question. One is dealing with the symptoms. And actually, this point about anticipatory action is really, really important. Unless we can follow the evidence, which we've just done a randomized control trial in northern Nigeria, two sides of a valley, you give the farmers on one side of the valley the cash handout a week before the flood. Surprise, surprise, they do much better than the farmers on the other side of the valley who get the cash handout after the flood. So if you can get investment flowing before the crisis hits, and 20% of climate events, extreme climate events, are now anticipated, you can get ahead of the game. And that small example, I think, is a pointer to bigger changes which need to be facilitated by changes in the financing regime. You see, if you think about it, it's a bit odd that we've spent the whole conversation so far talking about aid flows, and by implication, bilateral aid flows. I think Kathy mentioned the multilateral system, and I agree with her very strongly about that. But just for example, we're trying to negotiate the world's first humanitarian debt swap. So the world has got used to green bonds, where you trade in, you buy out debt, and you spend the proceeds on environmental improvement. We've never had a humanitarian debt swap. But actually at a time when countries like Kenya or Somalia are facing 15% global interest rates, when money is coming out of poor countries to pay creditors, by the way, not just Western creditors, China is a massive creditor in this as well. It's not just a Western problem, this. But that doesn't make any sense, because money is leaving poor countries rather than being invested in poor countries. If you buy out some of that debt and invest a portion of it in humanitarian intervention, you're actually getting ahead of the game. I just want to reserve 30 seconds, because I don't want to lose what you said about, you mentioned politics and diplomacy. Here's the problem. The diplomatic rules of the game have been developed to mediate and resolve, sometimes successfully, often unsuccessfully, relations between states. But the 59 conflicts that Anneliese rightly referred to are conflicts in the main, in 95%, within states. And the rules of diplomacy, which are about sovereignty and territorial integrity, they don't give you the clues to resolving those intra-state conflicts, which is where you're seeing the proliferation, where you're seeing external actors, for example in Sudan, supporting different sides. So we've got a whole new toolkit for diplomacy that needs to be developed, and I don't want to lose that part of your question.
Could I add one thing?
Yes, of course, Kathy.
One thing, UNICEF is a UN agency that has two mandates. We do humanitarian and we do development. And I think it's really important because David's right, we do focus so much attention on the humanitarian crises because indeed they're horrific and so many children are impacted by them. But the work we do, both in humanitarian context and more generally in development, is really trying to build up the resilience of these countries through the children, that's our focus, so that they can deal with the fragility, right? So that we can try to address it from the beginning, so make sure that children are educated and that they're healthy and that they have social protection systems. If we can do that, it doesn't prevent everything, but it does help alleviate some of the problems. And so even when we do humanitarian work, we're always trying to plant the seeds of development so that over time, hopefully in theory, we can try to build up the system so that these countries have some more ability to push back on these challenges they're facing.
Yeah, I think it's very important. Yes, the lady third row from the back there.
Hi, my name is Kat O'Brien. I'm interested in what you feel like are some of the most important, most effective messaging to counter some of the rise in anti-immigration that's come about. I'm particularly familiar with in the US and Europe. I think obviously you can make moral arguments, but I find even in the US where immigrants are actually economically beneficial, including in the first generation, including refugees and asylees, maybe not the first few months, but very quickly, there's still this rise in anti-immigration sentiment. And what do you find to be some of the most effective counters?
Who would like to respond to that?
I'm happy to. I mean,
Yes.
well, you go. You won the election, so you should you should do it.
Well, yes, what can I say to that? Anyway, I mean, I did mention in my remarks, first of all, the fact that actually, I think in countries like the UK, you see the positive impact of that diversity, you know, day after day after day. I mean, last night, when I was obviously still in the UK, in Oxford, which is one of the cities in the UK that has the most diverse population, I was there as part of a peace vigil across all faiths and none, and it was very clear there the impact of having people from all across the world. You know, I often view my city as a place from which we have a window on the rest of the world. Of course, that's not always uncomplicated, but I think it is a strength for us, including on development, actually. You can barely walk down the street in Oxford without meeting someone who's worked for an NGO in the aid sector. Sometimes good. Sometimes when I'm wanting to do something else, not so good. Anyway, but I also think, actually, that evidence base around migration is one that we need to talk about much more. And I think it's particularly interesting if you look at some of the migration patterns that we're seeing now in some parts of Africa, where there's a very clear economic positive impact. Now, some of that is around urbanization as well, but some of it is also around migration. Of course, what we saw from the Eurozone as well, and the changes there. So I think it's about making sure these issues are always talked about with a view to evidence, and that's incredibly important, I think, as well as, of course, considering people's concerns too, and really not running away from those, actually having that grown-up conversation, making sure that we're having that conversation. And where people do have concerns, you know, for example, in my own country, those concerns have arisen. We've had a situation with small boats that was mentioned before. Now, that's a situation where you have people who are being put in appalling danger. You have people smugglers who are making an enormous amount of money out of individuals' distress. You know, together, we want to make sure that we are actually dealing with that situation, above all, by tackling the drivers of why those people are seeking to move in the first place. Now, that's a conversation that, you know, some people within the development community find a bit difficult. They feel that it's not where they want to start. I understand that. But ultimately, we do need to be seeking to understand why people feel their only option is to move and doing something about it. And that's certainly what the new government's trying to do in the UK.
Okay, do you want to add something?
I mean, I think the three things that you have to address are, one, is it fair? And the fairness isn't just between immigrant populations and host populations, it's between US states and between European countries? In other words, is there a fair distribution? Secondly, is it orderly? Disorder is not in the interests of people trying to seek asylum, nor is it in the interest of host populations. And then finally, is it smart, really, in that it distinguishes between those who are seeking a better life to choose to move and those who are forced to leave their own home. I always say to people, if you're the baker in Damascus whose house is bombed by Assad and you're seeking asylum in the US after being in Jordan, you're in a different position than someone who wants to move to join their cousin in New York. It's not that one's good and the other's bad, they're different. And we have to be able to get that distinction. When we came into government in 1997, there was a massive backlog of Kosovan asylum seekers. When you've got asylum and immigration mixed, it's not good for either. You've got to be able to have a policy for immigration and fulfill your responsibilities in respect of asylum. And I think that is possible, but you've got to recognize the differences between them.
Yeah. There was a follow-up question. Yes, third row. Yes.
Hello, my name is Kawala, and I'm from Cameroon. Just going back to the theme of the panel, I totally agree with Mr. Miliband that we're talking about transformation of the cooperation between our countries. It's such a huge mind shift that we all have to do. And one of the things that needs to happen in Western countries is, as you rightly explained, the conflicts on the ground. And we want to stay home. We do not want to migrate. For the most part, we want to stay home. So we should shift our focus to how can we make our homes livable so that we stay. The conflicts right now on the ground, at least in Africa, are so complex, so entrenched over so many decades that they have built up, that they need diplomacy, military, humanitarian, and development to work together in a concerted strategy. Now, in your countries, let me take Germany for an example. Germany, huge development budget and lots of projects around Africa, at least. Germany also, one of the biggest donors, contributors at the IMF or the World Bank. Does the Minister of Finance, who sits at the IMF, concert with the Minister of BMZ, the minister was just here, on its policy on Cameroon? The answer is no. And that's a huge problem. And we are not going to solve these conflicts until they do, and until we have synergistic strategies, because the situation on the ground needs all of these different strategies to work together towards a common goal. And as Mr. Miliband said, I agreed with almost like 110% of what you said. The governments they're actors in these crises. And so you can't stay over here in diplomacy and say, well, I'm a state-to-state partner, and I have to, we have to figure different things out. So it's a huge, huge shift for those of us on the ground working towards this. And the good news in Africa is there are movements all across the continent fighting for social justice, putting their lives on the line for democracy and justice. And we need to find ways to work together because we want to stay home.
Yeah.
Now, what you said about the synergies and how the different instruments that governments dispose of when being in relation to certain countries have to be together. Anneliese, what is your impression after having been in office now for 4 months, 5 months? How is this cooperation working where you say it's not taking place? Do you have the impression, yes, in cabinet you talk to each other and you look at the issue from one angle?
Yes, we do. I mean, I was just writing down when those really powerful remarks were made that, you know, in the UK side, we had 14 years to talk to each other about our general approach to matters of, you know, international justice and combating poverty. So we have quite an aligned approach across governments, and I think that is incredibly important. But if I may, it's not good enough just to have that alignment, of course, across one government. We believe you also have to have that partnership clearly with other countries too. And for the new UK government, that means working particularly with, obviously, with our European friends, with the US, Australia, and so forth, but working with many other countries as well, much more intensively into the future. It's one reason why I was really pleased to be working with President Lula's government on his Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, being clear that from the beginning for the UK, these matters are also ones about inequality, including racial inequality, as well as inequality of gender too, and for disabled people. Now, that's quite a different approach, I would argue, than one which is always taken by, you know, a country like the UK. So I think it's both having that coordination across government, but then seeking to work with other countries in genuine partnership. Doesn't mean agreeing on everything, but seeking to make sure we work together where we can to deliver benefits.
Kathy, you wanted to add to that?
I'd just say two things about that. One is, I think everyone accepts that there needs to be better and more coordination. And, you know, I came from the US government, I come to the UN. It's amazing how big that bureaucracy is, how much effort goes into coordination, right? We try to coordinate across the UN system, across the whole multilateral system. You have the IFIs, you have bilateral donors. It's a full-time job to coordinate, but I think you're right. We do need to coordinate better, and we need to make sure that people are coming in, entities are coming in and doing what they're best at, and not everybody trying to do everything. But I think the key, from our perspective, the key piece of information here is that we really have to be led by the local actors. Whether that's the government, if there's a government in place, which is the ideal situation, then we try to build up the capacity of the government to act, and we do a lot of work on that side because ultimately those governments have the responsibility and I think the obligation to do this for their populations. If they don't, in some of the places that David was mentioning where we have, you know, we just don't have governments acting. There, it is much more complicated and we end up doing so much more humanitarian work rather than development work. But I think we're in every place where we act, where we work, we do have local people who are local organizations, NGOs, who are really the key players here, I think, and we need to take our lead from them and then come in behind them with all of the strength and resources that we possibly can bring to bear.
Can I just do a 20-second plea to you? If you wait for the multilateral agencies and the different donor governments to agree a set of outcomes between them that they're aiming for, we'll be waiting a very long time. I would plead with you, Cameroon's a great example, for you to demand, it doesn't matter if you're a humanitarian actor, a development actor, a UN actor, a donor, an NGO, you should all be bound by a limited set of outcomes that are practical mechanism of accountability. And then you'll drive the transparency, you'll drive the bad actors out, you'll drive the better actors in, but it's got to come from you saying, hang on, all these different organizations, according to different mandates, different accountabilities, different outcome measures, different bureaucracies, is not serving us on the ground. And that idea of collective outcomes was launched by Ban Ki-moon in his last year as UN Secretary General, and it's not been picked up. And one reason it's not being picked up is it's a threat to a lot of powerful interests. It would be true localization if in the east of Cameroon, where there are Central African Republic refugees, if you said, outcomes for us in this context mean the following four things. In the north of Cameroon, where you've got Boko Haram and a whole Lake Chad basin, this is the set of outcomes. In the west of Cameroon, it's actually Anglophone, Francophone, it's different. It's this set of outcomes. And that would be the most powerful tool to really drive the system in the interests of people on the ground.
Wonderful. I think that was
I think I've exceeded my time.
Very good. No, very good final.
Okay.
Very good final statement. Insofar as on the one hand, yes, there's a lot of responsibilities on the governments represented here or where you come. But then there's a lot of responsibility in the countries that receive to, be rational, get their act together, coordinate everything. Thank you so much for being on this panel. Thank you for listening.